So, last lesson we started to look at poverty. And the World Bank estimates that almost 3 billion people, close to half the world's population, live in absolute poverty, which they define as living on less than $2.50 per day. Now, over 10% of the global population, that's almost 800 million people, are in an extreme form of absolute poverty, defined as living on less than $1.90 per day. These people are living lives of near permanent hunger, often on the verge of starvation. Around 3 million children per year die from malnutrition. Almost all of these people live in what's called the Global South, Africa, Asia and Latin America. This has led some to talk of a global North-South divide. This concept was popularized by the so-called Brandt reports, commissioned by the Chancellor of West Germany, Willy Brandt, in the early 1980s. The Brandt reports highlighted the tendency for industrial development to be concentrated in the global north, with poverty and disadvantage concentrated in the global south. So the global north was characterized by high levels of investment, high wages, and high technology, whilst the global south was characterized by, as I said, poverty, low levels of investment, low wages, and primarily exporting raw materials such as agricultural products. But the reports went further than identifying this division. They argued that the policies and actions of the North, of the northern countries, helped to maintain and perpetuate this global division. In other words, the divide itself constituted a structure that systematically disadvantaged the countries of the global South and prevented them from prospering. The reports highlighted a number of processes which helped perpetuate this structural inequality, including things like aid, the type and quantity of aid given from north to south. Debt, the huge interest payments that amount to a huge transfer of wealth from the south to the north. Trade, the structure of the world trading system, it was argued systematically benefited the north at the expense of the south. And finally, the activities of TNCs, transnational corporations, multinational companies mostly based in the north, which exploit the labour and resources of the south, often at great environmental and social expense. All of these processes help to maintain this inequality between north and south, the industrialised north and the global south. And we'll see how these processes exactly work to help to maintain global inequality and poverty in the weeks to come. However, some have questioned whether the concept of a North-South divide is really still relevant. Remember, this idea came about in the early 1980s and a lot's changed since then. In particular, there have been three main changes that have occurred since the early 1980s when the Brandt report first identified the North-South divide, which have led some to conclude that it's no longer relevant to speak of such a divide. First of all is what are called equalising trends. In other words, we're talking about the development of large parts of the global south, and especially the so-called emerging economies. So from the late 1980s onwards, a number of countries in Southeast Asia in particular, known as the tiger economies, managed to industrialize, challenging the idea that all global south countries were necessarily structurally disadvantaged. So I'm talking here that the East Asian tigers, as they were called, includes places like Taiwan, South Korea, Hong Kong, and so on. More recently, the last 2 decades have seen phenomenal levels of economic growth in countries like China and India, both of which have seen so-called double-digit growth year on year, far higher than levels in the developed world. This is particularly significant as those two countries alone contain around 40% of the world's population. So we now have a situation where China, for example, is arguably highly developed. Some people argue it no longer really qualifies to be in the category of a developing country. It's now the second largest economy and swiftly on its way, most experts believe, to become the single largest economy in the world, overtaking the US very soon. Secondly, I should mention with China as well that according to the UN, since around 1990, I think 627 million people have been lifted out of poverty in China by various anti-poverty policies that China has adopted. Secondly, is the concentration of extreme poverty in Sub-Saharan Africa. Around half those people who live in absolute poverty that I mentioned, or the people who live in extreme poverty, around half of them, almost 400 million people, live specifically in Sub-Saharan Africa. So some people believe that talking about the Global South as a whole paints a misleading picture of poverty. For whilst countries like China and India are rapidly developing, Sub-Saharan Africa remains highly impoverished, with 3/4 of the population thought to be undernourished, and less than half having reliable access to clean water. So some have referred to Africa as a fourth world, and the argument is that actually it's not correct to talk about the Global South as a whole being characterized by high levels of poverty, but rather specific pockets within the Global South, such as Sub-Saharan Africa. And thirdly, another reason people argue the North-South divide is no longer a relevant concept is the growing prominence of inequality within countries. So this is what we call intra-country equality, meaning inequality within countries, rather than inter-country equality, inequality between countries. So some argue that inequality today is more prevalent within countries than between them. The fall of communism in Eastern Europe, for example, dismantled the social security systems that had existed, plunging millions into poverty, whilst others became billionaires overnight. So Russia and across the countries of the former Soviet Union have now got massive levels of inequality and high levels of poverty in some places as well, whereas this didn't used to be the case. In China, where, as I say, 627 million people have been lifted out of poverty since 1980, inequality has also grown, with a new class of millionaires emerging. And even in prosperous countries such as Britain, inequality has grown rapidly in recent decades, as taxes on the rich have been reduced since the 1980s, and wages stagnated, and also benefits have stagnated and been cut as well in recent years under the austerity budgets of successive Conservative-led governments. So we're seeing now a big change from the situation, say, in 1980, when before China had industrialized, before India had industrialized, where you could see, well, there was really a North-South divide. Generally, the Global South was underdeveloped, was mainly rural and agricultural, and by and large, the countries in the north were largely free of extreme poverty. Today, the argument is the situation has changed, and actually there are large amounts of poverty in the north, whilst at the same time many areas in the Global South are industrializing. Personally though, I believe the concept is still relevant, also for three main reasons. So first of all, differences in income between North and South remain massive. Even in China, despite China's impressive growth, which has made it the world's second largest economy, in terms of per capita income, it remains a poor country, with average incomes less than a quarter of those in the US. So per capita income is the total wealth of the country divided by the number of people in the country, the average amount of wealth per head. Still around a quarter of the average in the US. Secondly, the structures of the world economy remain dominated by the global north. Decision-making in important economic bodies like the World Bank, the IMF, the International Monetary Fund, and the WTO, the World Trade Organization, are still largely controlled by countries such as the USA. And the world's largest TNCs, transnational corporations, are still US-based and global north-based in general. And finally, as Egyptian economist Samir Amin has noted, the leading countries of the global north continue to dominate key areas of economic power such as global finance, high technology industries such as weapons and pharmaceuticals. They also tend to dominate the global media industry, as well as agribusiness. So in these key sectors, high technology industry, finance and so on, still remain very much dominated by the global north.